hadn't been back to the campsite since my grandfather died. It wasn't even a real campsite, just a clearing deep in the woods, a place he had found decades ago and turned into something of a family tradition. No marked trails, no facilities, just a flat patch of earth surrounded by thick trees, a fire pit made of stones, and an old log we used as a makeshift bench. For as long as I could remember, my grandfather and I had spent summers out there, camping for days at a time, fishing in the creek, hunting in the colder months, cooking over an open flame. It had been our place, a secret tucked away in the dense wilderness, away from the noise of the world. But after he passed, I couldn't bring myself to go back. Took me a full year before I packed my gear and decided to return. Maybe it was guilt that I had let the place sit empty, abandoned. Maybe it was grief, a way to feel closer to him again. Whatever the reason, I found myself driving up the narrow dirt road one late autumn afternoon, the bed of my truck packed with supplies. The road hadn't changed, still rough, still barely wide enough for a single vehicle. Trees leaned in from both sides, their branches stretching over the path, turning it into a tunnel of yellow and brown. Leaves crunched under my tires as I slowly made my way deeper into the woods. By the time I reached the spot where I usually parked, the sun had started to dip behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the ground. The air smelled like damp earth and fallen leaves, the familiar scent of the forest in autumn. I stepped out of the truck and grabbed my pack. The clearing was about a half-mile in, a short hike through thick underbrush and uneven ground. It had been a while, but my feet knew the way, muscle memory guiding me along the barely visible path. When I stepped into the clearing, a strange feeling washed over me. The place looked the same, untouched, undisturbed, but something felt off. Maybe it was just in my head. Memories flooded back, images of my grandfather sitting by the fire, whittling a piece of wood, his old rifle leaning against a tree. I set up my tent near the fire pit, where we had always camped. The ground was cold beneath my hands as I hammered in the stakes. The temperature had dropped fast, the crisp autumn air settling in. By the time I got a fire going, the last light of the sun had disappeared, leaving only the flickering glow of the flames to push back the darkness. I sat on the old log, eating a can of chili, listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets, the occasional rustling of leaves, an owl hooting in the distance. It should have felt peaceful, didn't. That uneasy feeling from before hadn't gone away. If anything, it had gotten worse. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. It was stupid, I knew that. I had camped here countless times. I had spent nights in these woods since I was a kid. But something about this night felt different. I told myself it was just being back for the first time since my grandfather died. My mind playing tricks on me, filling the empty space with shadows and memories. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than usual. The trees beyond the firelight seemed darker than they should have been, the spaces between them impossibly deep. I forced myself to focus on the fire, on the warmth against my face, on the way the flames twisted and snapped. I stayed up later than I normally would, not wanting to crawl into my tent just yet. But eventually I had to. I banked the fire, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. The forest was alive with the usual nighttime sounds, a comforting background noise that I had grown up with. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was awake, heart pounding in my chest, the kind of wake-up that comes from something external, not a dream. I held my breath, listening. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow against the canvas of my tent. The forest was silent, too silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then a sound, a single footstep, not an animal. An animal moves in quick, light steps. This was slow, deliberate. I stayed completely still. Another footstep. It was close, just outside my tent. I reached for the knife I had tucked beside me, my fingers wrapping around the handle. My mind raced. A bear? No, a bear wouldn't move like that. Person? There was no reason for anyone to be out here. Another step. My pulse pounded in my ears. The tent fabric barely moved, but I could feel something just beyond it, something standing there, watching. I don't know how long I lay there, gripping the knife, waiting. The footsteps didn't come closer, but they didn't move away either. Just waiting. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I heard movement again, this time retreating, slow steps fading into the woods. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. When I finally worked up the nerve to unzip the tent, my breath caught in my throat. Footprints, human footprints, circling my tent, pressed deep into the damp earth. I packed up my gear in record time, barely stopping to douse the embers of my fire. My hands were shaking as I threw everything into my pack and started back toward the truck. The whole hike back, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something, standing just beyond the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty woods. When I reached the truck, I tossed my gear in the back and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. My fingers were ice cold against the steering wheel. I didn't look back as I drove away. I haven't been back since. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't think I want to know. All I know is that my grandfather's campsite, the place that had once felt like home, now feels like something else entirely. And I have no plans of ever returning. I never liked camping alone, but I had done it before. The idea of heading out into the quiet woods, away from everything, seemed peaceful at first. I wasn't the kind of person who needed constant company, and I had always thought of myself as careful. But I learned the hard way that no matter how much you prepare, no matter how much you think you know, there are things out there, people out there that you just can't plan for. It was late September, just as the summer heat had started fading into cooler, more tolerable nights. I had taken a few days off from work, packed up my gear, and drove out to a remote area in the Adirondacks. I knew the region well, isolated but still close enough to a few marked trails. I wasn't staying at a designated campsite. I preferred to go deeper into the woods, far from other campers. Some people might call that reckless, but I had been doing it for years. I parked my truck off an old dirt road, a good 15 miles from the nearest town. The hike to my chosen spot was about 4 miles in. I carried everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, plenty of food, a good knife, and my rifle. I never went camping without a weapon, not because I was scared of animals, but because I knew what people were capable of. The first night was uneventful. I set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by thick trees, near a stream where I could filter water. It was perfect, completely silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves or chirp of a bird, the kind of silence that makes you feel small, like the rest of the world doesn't even know you exist. The second day, I decided to go on a long hike. I left my campsite around noon, following a ridge that gave me a clear view of the valley below. The air was crisp, the sky was clear, and for the first time in months, I felt completely at peace. I had a good 6 hours of daylight left when I turned back, making my way through thick brush, using my GPS to guide me. That's when I noticed something was off. At first, it was just a feeling, that subtle shift in the atmosphere, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I stopped walking, listening. The woods were too quiet. No wind, no birds, nothing. I scanned the area but didn't see anything. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I had been alone out here before, but something about this felt different. I picked up my pace, keeping my rifle in my hands now instead of strapped to my back. The closer I got to my campsite, the stronger that uneasy feeling became. And then I saw it. Footprints, fresh ones, leading toward my camp. I hadn't seen a single person since I got here. No other tents, no sign of hikers. But someone had been here. The prints weren't mine. The treads were different. They were deep, heavier than my own, and spaced further apart. Whoever made them had a long stride. I crouched low, scanning the area. My first thought was that maybe a hunter had wandered through. But why would they come straight to my camp? There were no hunting grounds in this area, and I hadn't heard a single gunshot all day. My tent was still standing, but I could see that something had been disturbed. The flap was slightly open. I knew I had zipped it shut before leaving. I moved slowly, my rifle up, finger resting lightly on the trigger. I listened for any sound, any movement, but there was nothing. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, nudging the tent flap open with the barrel of my rifle. Inside, everything looked the same, almost. My sleeping bag had been unrolled, like someone had laid in it. My backpack was open, the contents shuffled through. My knife, the one I kept next to my sleeping bag, was gone. I stood there, heart pounding, my mind racing. Someone had been here, and they had taken my knife. But where were they now? I backed out of the tent, scanning the trees. The sun was starting to set, shadows stretching across the ground. I had two choices: stay and try to figure out who had been here, or pack up and get the hell out. I decided to leave. I moved quickly, stuffing my gear into my pack, keeping my rifle close. I could hike back to my truck in a few hours if I kept a steady pace. As I slung my bag over my shoulders, I heard it, a twig snapping. Close. I froze. Then, another sound, slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the underbrush. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide anymore. I turned toward the noise, my rifle raised, and that's when I saw him, a man standing about 20 yards away, just at the edge of the trees. He was tall, wearing dark clothes. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I knew he was looking at me. Neither of us moved. I gripped my rifle tighter. "I have a gun," I said, though I knew it was useless. No one else was around to hear. The man just stood there. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the trees. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack and started moving, fast. My instincts screamed at me to get to the truck. I kept my rifle up, scanning the trees as I walked. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen. I didn't see him again, but I knew he was still there. I could feel it. The sky darkened. My flashlight cut through the trees, but every shadow felt like a threat. The forest had changed. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was a trap. 2 miles in, I heard something behind me. Footsteps, faster this time. I didn't look back. I ran. Branches whipped against my face. My boots pounded against the dirt. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I just needed to reach my truck. 100 yards from the road, I heard a sound that made my stomach drop. A second set of footsteps, ahead of me. I skidded to a stop, my breath coming in ragged gasps. They were trying to cut me off. I veered left, crashing through the trees. I could see the road now, my truck a dark silhouette against the night. Then, a sharp pain in my leg. It fell hard. My knee hit a rock, my rifle slipping from my grip. I scrambled for it, my fingers wrapping around the barrel just as I heard footsteps closing in. I spun around, lifting my rifle. Nothing. Silence. I forced myself to stand, limping the last few yards to my truck. I fumbled for my keys, throwing the door open and slamming it shut behind me. My hands shook as I locked the doors, my chest heaving. For a long moment, I just sat there, gripping the wheel. Then movement. In my headlights, I saw them. 2 figures standing just at the edge of the trees, watching. I didn't wait to see what they would do. I turned the key, the engine roared to life, and I tore out of there, my tires kicking up dirt and gravel. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, my heart still hammering in my chest. I never went back. I don't know who they were. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know this, they weren't just passing through. They were waiting, and I was never supposed to leave. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. It had been a long, exhausting year, and I just wanted to get away from everything: work, emails, traffic, noise. I needed some peace, the kind you can only find deep in the wilderness, where the only sounds are the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional crackle of a campfire. I picked a spot far from the usual campsites, deep in a stretch of national forest that wasn't well traveled. It was late September, and the summer crowds had thinned out. The air had that crisp, dry smell of early autumn, and the leaves were just beginning to change color. I had checked the weather before leaving. Clear skies, no storms in sight. It was perfect. I drove for hours down winding, empty roads, my truck loaded with supplies. The farther I went, the fewer signs of civilization there were. The last stretch was on a dirt road, barely wide enough for one vehicle, with deep grooves and rocks that rattled my suspension. Eventually, I reached a small clearing that looked untouched. It was far enough from any major trails that I wouldn't see another person the entire trip. That's exactly what I wanted. I set up camp near a small stream. It was quiet, peaceful, just the way I liked it. The air smelled of pine, and the sky was beginning to turn soft shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped lower. I gathered wood, set up my tent, and got a fire going before dark. Felt good to be out here, away from everything. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, ate a simple meal, and enjoyed the silence. When the fire died down, I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and let the sounds of the forest lull me to sleep. I woke up sometime in the night, feeling strange. I wasn't sure why at first. Maybe it was just the unfamiliar surroundings, the way it always takes a night or two to get used to sleeping outdoors. But then I noticed it, an absence of sound. The forest was completely silent. No crickets, no rustling of leaves, nothing. I listened, waiting, straining my ears in the dark. Then, just as I was convincing myself it was nothing, I heard it. A single, deliberate footstep outside my tent. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. Could have been an animal, but it sounded too heavy, too slow. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam shone through the thin fabric of the tent, casting shadows, but I saw nothing outside. I waited, holding my breath, ears straining for any sound. Nothing. After what felt like forever, I convinced myself it was my imagination. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe a deer had wandered too close. I forced myself to lie back down and eventually fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and looked around. The forest was bright and calm, as if nothing had happened. But then I saw them, footprints. Human footprints just a few feet from my tent. They weren't mine. The prints circled my tent, stopping and starting, like someone had been standing there, just watching. My stomach twisted. I looked around, scanning the trees, but there was no one in sight. I told myself it must have been a hiker passing through, someone who didn't realize I was there. But I knew that wasn't true. No one hikes this deep into the woods at night, alone, without a flashlight. Still, I tried to shake it off. I had driven hours to get here. I wasn't going to let paranoia ruin my trip. I spent the day fishing, hiking, and trying to push the unease from my mind. That night, I built my fire bigger than before. I kept my flashlight close. I listened carefully. Around midnight, I heard it again. A sound in the distance. Branches snapping, footsteps, slow and careful. not the random rustling of an animal. Someone was out there. I killed my flashlight, hoping to let my eyes adjust to the dark. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing. The footsteps got closer. Then, just beyond the light of the dying fire, I saw it. A figure, standing between the trees, just watching. I couldn't make out a face, just a dark shape. Not moving, just standing there. A cold wave of fear washed over me. My knife was in my pack, a few feet away. My rifle was in the truck, 100 yards from camp. I was alone, unarmed, and completely exposed. I had two choices: stay and wait or make a run for my truck. I moved slowly, trying not to make a sound. But the second I shifted, the figure bolted. Not away, toward me. I barely had time to react. I lunged for my pack, grabbing my knife, but before I could get a grip, something slammed into my tent. A sharp, metallic sound. A knife? An axe? I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my pack and sprinted toward my truck, crashing through the undergrowth, heart hammering. I could hear footsteps behind me, fast, closing the distance. I reached the truck and yanked the door open, fumbling for the rifle behind the seat. Just as my fingers wrapped around it, something heavy slammed against the side of the truck. A face appeared in the window, pale, wild eyes, grinning. I didn't hesitate. I raised the rifle and fired through the glass. The figure staggered back, a sharp cry piercing the night. I didn't stay to check if he was dead. I threw the truck into gear and tore out of there, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel. I drove like a madman, not stopping, not looking back. Only when I hit the main road did I finally pull over, hands shaking, adrenaline still coursing through me. The next morning, I went to the nearest ranger station and reported what had happened. They sent a team out, but they didn't find anything. No body, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. But I know what I saw. I never went back to that forest. And I never camp alone anymore. Because whoever was out there that night, he's still out there, waiting. I had always been someone who loved the outdoors. There was something about the quiet of the forest, the crisp night air, and the feeling of being completely alone with my thoughts that gave me peace. I had camped more times than I could count, in all seasons, in different places. But nothing I had experienced before compared to what happened one weekend in the fall of 2017. I had taken a few days off work and decided to spend them in the woods of northern Michigan. I had camped there before, but this time, I wanted to try a more remote area, somewhere deeper in the forest where I wouldn't run into other campers. I picked a spot near a small lake that was about 5 miles from the nearest trailhead. It wasn't a well-known camping spot, but that was exactly why I chose it. I wanted solitude, and I was sure I'd find it there. I arrived in the late afternoon, parked my truck at the trailhead, and started the hike in. The air was cool, and the leaves had already started to change colors, covering the forest floor in reds, oranges, and yellows. It was a perfect day for hiking, and I made good time, reaching my chosen campsite in just under 2 hours. The lake was just as I had remembered it, calm, quiet, and untouched. There were no signs of anyone else having been there recently. I set up my tent a few yards from the water, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped quickly, and I was grateful for the warmth of the flames. I cooked a simple meal, ate while listening to the sounds of the forest, then sat by the fire for a while before finally turning in for the night. The first night was uneventful. I slept well, waking up only once when I heard what I thought was an animal moving through the trees. It didn't sound close, so I didn't worry about it and went back to sleep. The next day, I spent my time fishing in the lake, hiking around the area, and just enjoying the solitude. The only strange thing I noticed was that I didn't see much wildlife. Normally, I'd hear birds in the trees, see squirrels darting around, or maybe even spot a deer. But that day, the woods felt oddly empty. I told myself it was just my imagination and didn't think much of it. That night, things started to feel different. I went to bed early, exhausted from the day's activities. I must have fallen asleep quickly because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to a sound outside my tent. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or snapping of twigs that you'd expect in the woods. It was a slow, deliberate movement like footsteps. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. I waited, heart pounding, straining to hear anything else. After a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself that it had been an animal and tried to go back to sleep. But just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again. Closer this time. Something or someone was moving outside my tent. I lay still, not wanting to make a sound. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? Unlikely. I had seen no signs of them in the area. And besides, bears usually made more noise when moving through the woods. Person? That idea unsettled me more than the thought of an animal. I had chosen this location specifically because it was so remote. The chances of someone else being out here were slim. The footsteps stopped again. I waited, barely breathing, listening to the silence that followed. Then, out of nowhere, something brushed against the side of my tent. I froze. My body went rigid. It was a light touch, almost as if someone had run their fingers across the fabric. My mind screamed at me to grab my flashlight, my knife, anything, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, my brain struggling to make sense of what was happening. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I didn't know. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and at some point, I drifted back into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside my tent cautiously, scanning the area for any signs that someone had been there. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, making it impossible to see footprints. But something was off. My firewood, which I had stacked neatly the night before, was scattered. Not in a way that suggested an animal had gotten into it, but as if someone had deliberately kicked it over. A feeling of unease settled over me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that maybe I had just stacked the wood poorly and it had fallen over on its own. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I debated packing up and leaving, but I had one more night before I had to head back, and I didn't want to cut my trip short over what was probably just my imagination running wild. I spent the rest of the day on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder, listening for any unusual sounds. The forest still felt too quiet, and by the time the sun started setting, I was questioning my decision to stay. But leaving meant hiking back to my truck in the dark, and that seemed like an even worse idea. That night, I built my fire bigger than usual, hoping it would keep whatever was out there away. I sat up as long as I could, staring into the trees, but eventually, sleep took over, and I crawled into my tent. I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not mine. It was close, right outside the thin fabric of my tent. I stayed as still as possible, barely daring to breathe myself. The sound was steady, slow, controlled. It wasn't the heavy breathing of an animal. It was human. My mind raced. Who was out here? What did they want? And why weren't they saying anything? Then, just as before, the sound stopped. Silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee. I just threw everything into my pack and started hiking back to my truck. The entire way, I felt like I was being watched. I kept looking back over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was no one. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack into the bed, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I sat there for a few minutes, catching my breath, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. Then, as I was about to start the engine, I noticed something in my side mirror. There, just at the edge of the trees, was a figure, standing completely still, watching me. I didn't wait to get a better look. I started the truck and drove away as fast as I could, not looking back until I was miles down the road. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I never went back to that spot, and I don't camp alone anymore. I used to love camping alone. It was peaceful, quiet, and gave me a break from everything: work, city noise, and people. I liked going deep into the wilderness where I wouldn't see another soul for days. That changed after my last trip. Now, I don't think I'll ever camp alone again. It was late October, the last real chance to camp before winter made it miserable. I had a 4-day weekend, so I drove out to a place I had been wanting to check out for a while. Somewhere deep in the Appalachian Mountains, far from any town or hiking trail. I found the spot on an old topographic map, a high ridge with a stream running below it. The closest road was over 20 miles away, exactly how I liked it. The first day was uneventful. I hiked in early, making sure to leave no sign of my route. It wasn't paranoia, just a habit. I always did that when I went deep into the woods. I picked a site near the ridge, set up my tent, and gathered firewood. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant bird calls. By nightfall, I had a fire going and ate my usual camp meal: jerky, nuts, and some boiled water for coffee. I sat back against a fallen log, listening to the fire crackle. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. I wasn't worried. My tent was waterproof, and I had enough gear to last comfortably. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard something in the distance. It wasn't an animal sound. It was movement, deliberate and slow. It came from down the ridge, where the trees were denser. I turned my head slightly, listening. The sound stopped. I didn't move, keeping my eyes on the fire, acting like I hadn't noticed. I've spent enough time in the woods to know when something isn't right. Predators, humans, or animals watch before they move in. After a few minutes, I stood up casually, stretched, and banked the fire so it wouldn't give off as much light. Then I turned in for the night, but I didn't sleep. I lay in my tent, listening. The wind had died down, and the forest was too quiet. No owls, no night insects, just silence. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it again, movement outside my tent. It was slow, circling. I reached for my knife, gripping the handle. I didn't hear breathing, just the soft crunch of leaves. I waited. The sound stopped near my tent entrance. Then something pressed against the fabric. A slow, deliberate pressure pushing inward. Not hard, just enough to make the material bend. I didn't move. The pressure stayed for a few seconds, then it was gone. I heard footsteps moving away, back into the woods. I stayed awake until dawn, knife in hand. When the sun finally came up, I unzipped the tent carefully and looked around. Nothing. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. But I knew what I heard. I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe a bear sniffing around, though bears usually make more noise. Maybe a deer. I packed up my gear, deciding to move campsites just in case. I hiked another mile deeper into the woods, closer to the stream. Found a good spot, set up again, and spent the day gathering more wood. The second night was worse. Started the same way. Quiet, then movement. This time it was faster. I heard something pacing just outside the fire's light. It would move, stop, then move again. Then came the smell. It was subtle at first, like damp fur. Then it grew stronger, something rotten, like meat left in the sun too long. It made my stomach turn. I gripped my knife again, staring at the darkness beyond the fire. I thought about grabbing my flashlight, but I didn't. Light attracts attention. The pacing continued for what felt like hours. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Again, I barely slept. When morning came, I found tracks near my camp, but they weren't normal. They looked human, barefoot, but the strides were too long, too unnatural. I should have left then, but I didn't. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was overthinking. I spent the day hiking further out, exploring the ridges and valleys. Found an old deer carcass, mostly picked clean. Thought nothing of it. That night, I made a bigger fire, hoping it would keep whatever was out there away. Didn't. Just past midnight, I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't just movement. It was breathing. Long, slow inhales. Exhales that rattled, almost like a growl. Came from behind me, just outside the fire's reach. I didn't turn around. Then the worst part, it spoke. Not words, not exactly, but something that sounded like words twisted and wrong. My name stretched out, broken. I don't know how long I sat there, gripping my knife, waiting. The fire flickered, casting shadows that seemed too long, too stretched. Then, just before dawn, the sound stopped. When the sun finally came up, I packed my gear in minutes. I didn't eat, didn't rest, just moved. The hike back was brutal. Every sound made my skin crawl. I kept expecting to see something following me. The feeling didn't go away until I reached my truck, threw my pack in, and drove without stopping. When I got home, I checked my gear. Everything was there except my knife. I don't remember losing it. I don't remember setting it down. I haven't been back since, and I won't. I had always enjoyed camping. The quiet of the woods, the fresh air, the feeling of being away from everything. It was something I had done many times before, but this time felt different. Maybe it was the weather, maybe it was something else, but as soon as I set up my tent that evening, I felt uneasy. I had driven out to a remote campsite in the mountains of Washington. It was late September, and the rain had started just as I arrived. Not heavy at first, just a steady drizzle, the kind that makes everything damp and miserable. My plan was to stay for 2 nights, do some hiking, and just get away from the stress of life. The place was far from any main road, and there were no other campers around. Just me, the trees, and the sound of rain hitting the leaves. After setting up my tent and getting a fire going, I sat back in my chair trying to enjoy the peace. The air was cold, but the fire helped. I had a small meal, then stretched my legs with a short walk around the campsite. The ground was already muddy, my boots sinking slightly as I stepped. The rain had picked up a little, and the sky had darkened earlier than usual. I decided to call it a night and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. I lay there, listening to the rain tapping against the fabric. It was soothing at first, but after a while, I started hearing something else. It was faint, mixed with the sound of the rain, but it was there. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, not the sound of an animal moving through the underbrush, but the sound of someone walking. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe it had been a branch falling. I forced myself to relax, pulling my sleeping bag tighter around me. A few hours later, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first, but then I heard it again. Footsteps, this time closer. My heart started pounding. I reached for the flashlight beside me, clicked it on, and shined it toward the tent's entrance. Nothing, just the sound of the rain. I listened for a few more minutes, but the sound was gone. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, the rain was still falling. I stepped out of my tent, stretching my stiff muscles. The ground was worse than the night before, the mud thicker, my boots sticking with each step. I walked around the campsite, looking for any signs of what I had heard during the night. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. I had been careful about where I stepped, and these were fresh. They circled my tent, then led off into the trees. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Someone had been here, walking around my tent while I slept. I tried to shake it off, telling myself maybe it had been a lost hiker, someone passing through. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. This place was too remote. No one should have been out here. I spent the rest of the day trying to enjoy my time, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped away from my tent, I found myself looking over my shoulder. The rain continued without stopping, making everything feel even heavier. I had planned to stay another night, but as the sun started to set, I knew I couldn't. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. The rain was coming down harder now, the wind picking up. The trees swayed, creaking. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and started the hike back to my truck. The trail was slick with mud, making each step difficult. I slipped more than once, catching myself just in time. The rain blurred my vision, my hood doing little to keep it out of my eyes. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time they weren't behind me. They were ahead. My heart stopped. I stood frozen, listening. The sound was coming closer. I couldn't see anything through the rain and trees, but I knew someone was there, watching, waiting. I didn't wait to find out who it was. I ran. My boots slid in the mud, my breath coming in gasps. I could hear the footsteps following, matching my pace. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning. The trail was barely visible in the dim light, but I knew I was getting close to my truck. I could see the break in the trees, the hint of the dirt road. Then, just as I reached my truck, the footsteps stopped. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing, just rain and trees. But I knew someone was there, just beyond the light, watching me. I fumbled with my keys, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, and peeled out, my tires skidding in the mud. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main road, the rain still pounding against my windshield. I never went back to that campsite, never tried to find out who had been out there, but I still think about it, about the footprints, about the feeling of being watched, about how close they had been to my tent, standing there in the rain, just listening. And I wonder, if I hadn't woken up that night, if I hadn't left when I did, what would have happened? I had been planning the trip for a while. A few days off work, some time away from the noise of the city, just me, my tent, and the open countryside. It was the kind of escape I needed, something simple, something quiet. I had always enjoyed camping alone, though most people I knew didn't understand why. They would ask, "Isn't it boring?" Or "What if something happens?" But I liked the solitude. I liked hearing nothing but the wind, the rustling trees, the distant sound of birds settling in for the night. I picked a remote spot in Northumberland, far from any major roads. It was late September, and the days were already growing shorter. The nights carried that early bite of autumn chill, but I had packed well. My rucksack was full: tent, sleeping bag, a small gas stove, enough food to last 4 days, a good quality torch, a knife, and all the other bits I might need. The spot I chose was deep in the woods, miles away from any town. The nearest village was at least an hour's drive away. I had parked my car in a designated area and hiked for about 5 miles, following a narrow dirt path through the trees. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. Eventually, I reached a small clearing next to a slow-moving stream. The ground was soft, the grass was short, and there were no signs of other campers. Perfect. I set up my tent as the sun dipped lower in the sky. By the time I had finished, the forest had taken on that eerie silence that only comes when night is settling in. The occasional gust of wind made the trees sway, their branches creaking overhead. The stream beside me gurgled softly, the only consistent noise in the silence. I cooked a simple meal, eating it while sitting on a fallen log, watching the last light fade from the sky. When the darkness fully took over, I felt that familiar sense of smallness that always came with being alone in the wilderness. The stars were out, the air was crisp, and aside from the occasional rustle in the underbrush, everything was still. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and settled into my sleeping bag. The night was cold, but I had come prepared. Sleep came easily. At first, I thought it was part of my dream. A sound, distant but distinct. It pulled me from my sleep slowly, that strange moment where your mind still clings to the haze of unconsciousness before fully waking. A crunch. I lay still, listening. Another crunch. Footsteps. I felt my heartbeat pick up. Could have been an animal. Fox, maybe a badger. But something about it felt off. The steps were slow, deliberate. I held my breath, waiting for them to stop. They didn't. They moved in a slow, irregular pattern, circling around the area near my tent. Then silence. I stayed as still as possible, my body rigid inside my sleeping bag. I listened for minutes, but there was nothing, just the usual nighttime sounds. After a while, I convinced myself I had imagined it. The mind plays tricks when you're alone in the dark. I told myself it was just an animal and forced my eyes closed. Morning came with a thick fog hanging over the trees. The ground was damp with dew, and the air carried that fresh, earthy smell of wet leaves and soil. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. Then I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, pressed deep into the soft earth. They circled my tent, moving in a slow, looping path before disappearing into the trees. They were human, barefoot. The breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to check my surroundings, but the woods were still. The silence felt heavier now. I crouched down, inspecting the prints more closely. They weren't old. The edges were crisp, undisturbed by wind or rain. Someone had been here, watching. I stood up and scanned the tree line. My gut told me whoever had left them wasn't far. I had a choice to make: stay or leave. I told myself I was overreacting, that the footprints could have been left by a hiker who had passed through before I arrived. But I knew that wasn't true. I had checked the ground when I first set up camp. There hadn't been any footprints then. Someone had walked around my tent while I was sleeping. Still, I convinced myself to stay. I had traveled too far to pack up after just one night. I forced myself to push the fear aside. I ate breakfast quickly, then decided to explore the area, partly to clear my head, partly to see if I could spot any other signs of someone nearby. I walked along the stream for about a mile, moving slowly, scanning the ground for more prints. I didn't find any. When I returned to camp, everything was as I had left it. I still felt uneasy, but I told myself that if I ignored it, it would pass. As the day wore on, I tried to relax. I gathered firewood, cooked another meal, and forced myself to enjoy the quiet. When night came, the unease returned. The forest seemed darker, the silence deeper. I crawled into my tent early, leaving my knife within arm's reach. I didn't sleep well. Every sound outside made my pulse quicken. Every gust of wind through the trees made me tense. At some point in the night, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. I held my breath, heart hammering. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could feel someone standing there, waiting. I gripped my knife tightly, every muscle in my body locked in place. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Nothing. No movement. I couldn't bring myself to unzip the tent and look. I just lay there, motionless, waiting for morning. When the first light of dawn seeped through the trees, I finally moved. I unzipped the tent slowly, peering outside. The footprints were back. More of them this time. Deeper. Closer. They stopped right in front of my tent flap. I packed up immediately. I didn't bother eating or cleaning up my campsite. I shoved everything into my rucksack, slung it over my shoulders, and started the long walk back to my car. The entire way I felt watched. The trees seemed thicker, the silence more oppressive. Every so often, I would stop and listen, convinced I could hear something moving just out of sight. But every time I turned, there was nothing. When I reached my car, I threw my gear into the boot, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't relax until I was miles away, back on the main road. I never reported it, never told anyone about it. I don't camp alone anymore. I didn't know why I had come back. Maybe I had something to prove to myself. Maybe I just wanted to feel closer to him again. It had been a year since my husband, Mark, passed away. The silence of the house had been suffocating, and the weight of his absence made every day heavier. I thought going on a camping trip, just like we used to, would bring me some kind of peace, a way to feel like he was still with me, even if only in memory. Mark and I had spent so many weekends out in the wilderness, setting up our tent near quiet lakes, hiking through thick forests, sitting by the fire as the night closed in around us. He had always been the one who knew how to handle things. He was the one who built the fire, who knew what tracks belonged to what animal, who could hear a sound in the distance and tell if it was something to worry about or not. Without him, I felt like I was just pretending. I picked a place we had camped before, deep in the woods, a few miles from the nearest road. It was a place he had loved. I packed the gear myself, drove out there myself, carried the heavy backpack down the trail myself. The weight of it pressed into my shoulders, reminding me how much I had taken for granted when he was here. The first day passed quietly. I set up my tent near the same clearing where we had camped before, next to a small, still pond. I gathered some wood, lit a fire, and sat there as the sun sank below the trees. It was peaceful, but when night came, I started to feel it, the unease, the way the darkness pressed in, the way every sound seemed louder when there was no one else around. I wasn't used to being alone in a place like this. I told myself I was imagining things, that the sounds in the woods had always been there. I had just never noticed them as much because I had Mark beside me. I forced myself to sleep, though it was restless. The second day was harder. I hiked for a few hours, trying to lose myself in the quiet. The trees stretched high above, the ground soft with pine needles. The air smelled fresh, clean. But every so often, I had the feeling that something was off. It started as little things. A twig snapping behind me when I wasn't walking. A rustling sound that stopped the second I held my breath to listen. The feeling of being watched. I told myself it was nothing, probably an animal, maybe even just my mind playing tricks on me. But as the day stretched on, it got worse. I came back to my campsite in the late afternoon and found something that made my stomach drop. The firewood I had collected earlier was scattered. Not like something had knocked it over. It was spread out like someone had kicked through it. I stood there, staring at it, my heart pounding. A bear, I thought. Maybe. But bears don't just mess with firewood for no reason. And there were no tracks, no claw marks. It looked deliberate. I didn't want to let fear take over. I cleaned up the mess, rebuilt the fire, and tried to go about my night as if nothing was wrong. But as the sun set, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone out there. That night was worse than the first. I lay in my tent, trying to sleep, but every few minutes I heard something. Footsteps? Maybe, or just my paranoia, but I was sure I could hear something moving. Slow, careful, not an animal crashing through the brush. Something or someone trying not to be heard. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. Then, just as I was convincing myself it was nothing, I heard it. Something brushing against the side of my tent. Not wind, not a branch, something deliberate. My entire body went cold. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just listened, heart hammering in my chest. The sound moved, slow, circling the tent. I reached for the knife I had brought with me, gripping it tight, my fingers shaking. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The sound was gone, but I didn't sleep. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I unzipped the tent and looked outside, my stomach in knots. The campsite looked wrong. There were footprints, bare footprints, too large to be mine, too small to be Mark's if he had been here. They circled the tent. Someone had been out there, watching me. I should have packed up. I should have left. But I told myself it was nothing, that it was probably just a hunter passing through, that maybe I had imagined the sounds. I stayed. The third night was worse. I didn't bother trying to sleep. I sat up, knife in my hand, listening, and I heard it again. The slow, deliberate footsteps, but this time there was something else. Breathing, close, just outside the tent. I felt frozen, every instinct in my body screaming to run, but I couldn't. If I moved, whoever was out there would know I was awake. Then a shadow against the thin fabric of the tent. Tall, motionless. I held my breath. The shadow stayed, just standing there, watching. I gripped the knife so tight my hand ached. My body screamed to do something. Run, scream, fight. But I couldn't. Then, after what felt like forever, the shadow moved. Slowly. It backed away, then disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep. When the sun rose, I packed everything in minutes. I didn't eat, didn't even bother putting the fire out properly. I just shoved everything in my pack and started walking. Fast. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this, I will never go camping alone again. I had been driving for hours, the road stretching endlessly through the quiet countryside. I was heading to an old farm that belonged to a friend of mine. Well, not really a friend, more like an acquaintance. His name was Mark, and I had met him through a few mutual connections. He owned a big piece of land, mostly fields and some patches of woods, and he told me once that I was welcome to camp there if I ever wanted a quiet place to be alone for a while. I had no real reason to go, other than just wanting to be away from everything for a bit. I had been feeling restless lately, sick of the same routines, the same places, the same people. The idea of being out in the middle of nowhere, just me, my truck, and a tent, sounded like exactly what I needed. I reached the farm late in the afternoon. The place was old, the kind of farm you'd expect to see in a forgotten town. There was a big barn, faded red paint peeling from the wooden boards, and a farmhouse that looked like it hadn't been lived in for a while. Mark had mentioned he didn't really stay there much anymore. Said it was more of a family property than anything. He still owned it, but he lived in the city now, and the farm was just sitting there, empty. I parked my truck near the barn and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air was heavy with the smell of earth, grass, and something faintly musty, like damp wood. The fields stretched out in every direction, tall grass swaying slightly in the breeze. A line of trees bordered the property on one side, dark and thick, almost like a wall. I grabbed my gear from the truck and started walking toward a small clearing near the edge of the woods. I figured it would be a good spot. far enough from the barn and house that I wouldn't feel like I was camping right next to abandoned buildings, but still close enough that I could use the barn for cover if the weather turned bad. Setting up camp was easy. I pitched my tent, set up my little fire pit, and pulled out a folding chair. The place was quiet. No cars, no voices, no city sounds. Just the occasional chirp of birds and the rustling of grass in the wind. I sat for a while, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. It was peaceful, exactly what I wanted. As the sun set, I started a fire and made myself some food. Simple stuff, just a can of beans and some jerky. The night air was cooling down and the fire felt good. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the flames, letting my mind drift. Then I heard something. It was faint, barely there, but enough to make me sit up a little straighter. It sounded like footsteps, not close, not right next to me, but somewhere out in the field. A soft, shuffling sound, like someone walking through the grass. I turned my head slowly, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing, just the empty fields, stretching out under the dim glow of the moon. I listened, holding my breath. Nothing. I told myself it was probably just an animal. A deer, maybe, or a coyote. Something moving through the grass, minding its own business. I forced myself to relax, leaning back in my chair again. But I kept my ears open. The night wore on. The fire crackled. The wind blew, and I let myself get lost in the quiet. Then, a few hours later, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it again. Closer this time. A slow, deliberate crunch of grass. I felt my stomach tighten. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring out into the darkness beyond the fire. Then, another step, and another. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was out there. I reached for the flashlight next to my chair and flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the field. The bright light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the tall grass, shifting slightly in the wind. I held it there for a few seconds, scanning, waiting. Nothing. After a moment, I turned the flashlight off, and that's when I heard it. A sound I still can't explain. A long, slow exhale. Not mine. Not the wind. Something else. It was close. Too close. I felt my pulse hammer in my throat. I turned the flashlight back on, whipping it around in the direction of the sound. Nothing. I stood up slowly, my body tense, every sense on high alert. I knew what my brain was telling me. Someone was out there, watching me, moving when I wasn't looking. I felt exposed, standing there in the open. My tent was useless. A thin piece of fabric wasn't going to protect me from anything. I needed to make a decision. Staying out there was no longer an option. I grabbed my keys from the chair, keeping the flashlight pointed into the darkness as I backed toward my truck. Every step felt like it took forever, my ears straining for any sound, my eyes darting to every shadow. The truck was only about 50 feet away, but it felt like a mile. I reached the door, yanked it open, and climbed inside, slamming it shut and locking it. For a long time, I just sat there, breathing hard, staring out into the night. My flashlight was still on, resting on the dashboard, its beam pointing toward the field. And then I saw it, just for a second, a shape barely visible at the edge of the light. A figure, standing, watching. My chest tightened, my fingers gripping the steering wheel. And then it was gone, just like that. I didn't waste another second. I started the truck, threw it into gear, and floored it. The tires spun for a half second on the dirt before catching, and then I was moving, speeding away from that place as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road, the farm nothing but a distant memory in my rearview mirror. I never went back. I never told Mark what happened. And to this day, I still don't know who or what was out there that night. But I know one thing for sure. I was not alone. had always liked being out in nature, away from the noise of the world. Camping alone wasn't something new to me, but this time, I wanted to push myself. A full week, deep in the woods with no one around. I picked a spot in a national forest, somewhere far from any trails. I wanted solitude, just me and the rain, because the forecast showed nothing but storms for the whole week. I arrived early in the morning, parked my truck on a dirt road, and hiked in with everything I needed: tent, food, water, extra clothes, a knife, an axe, and my rifle. I didn't expect trouble, but being alone in the woods, you had to be prepared. The air smelled like wet earth, the kind of scent that sticks to your skin when rain is coming. The trees were tall, stretching high into the sky, their branches thick with leaves that made everything darker underneath. The only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling of wind through the canopy. After about an hour of hiking, I found a good spot, a flat area near a small creek. The trees around it were dense enough to break the wind, but not so thick that I'd feel trapped. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire before the rain came. By late afternoon, the first drops started to fall. At first, it was light, tapping against the tent and leaves. But as the sun sank, it became heavier, turning the dirt into mud and making the creek swell. The fire struggled, but I had built a small cover for it using branches and a tarp. I sat under my own tarp, listening to the rain, eating a simple meal, and just enjoying the quiet. That first night was peaceful. The rain was constant, but I was dry in my tent. I fell asleep quickly, wrapped in my sleeping bag, the sound of raindrops lulling me into rest. I woke up to gray skies and more rain. The air was colder, and my fire was struggling. I added more wood, careful not to use too much since finding dry pieces was going to be difficult. I ate breakfast, then went out to explore. The forest felt different in the rain, darker, heavier, almost like it was pressing down on me. The trees dripped water constantly, and the ground was thick with mud. I followed the creek for a while, keeping an eye out for anything interesting: tracks, fallen trees, maybe a good fishing spot. That's when I noticed something strange. A set of footprints, deep in the mud, heading in the opposite direction. They weren't mine. They were fresh. I stopped, looked around, listened. Nothing. The rain made it impossible to hear anything else. The footprints weren't from boots. They were from someone barefoot. That made no sense. No one else should be out here, especially not walking around barefoot in the rain. I followed them for a bit, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. The thought of someone else being out here unsettled me, but I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe some hunter got caught in the rain and lost his shoes, or maybe they were old, washed up by the rain. Still, I went back to camp, kept my fire going, and stayed close to my rifle. I barely slept. Every sound outside my tent made me jump. The rain had gotten heavier overnight, turning the creek into a loud, rushing stream. The air smelled different too, earthy, but something else mixed in. Something off. I forced myself to eat, forced myself to do normal things, cut wood, check the area, try to enjoy being alone. But I kept thinking about those footprints. In the afternoon, I decided to look around again, this time with my rifle slung over my shoulder. I found something worse than footprints. Half a mile from my campsite, a dead deer was lying in the mud. But it wasn't just dead. It was torn apart. Its stomach was open, guts spilling out, like something had killed it and left it there. The meat was still fresh. It hadn't been dead for long. I checked for tracks. Nothing. No boot prints, no paw prints, nothing but disturbed mud. The rain had washed away whatever evidence was left. The thought of a predator being nearby wasn't what scared me. What scared me was that whatever had killed this deer hadn't eaten it. It was just left there. I hurried back to camp, my skin crawling. That night, I barely slept again. The rain was relentless, pounding against the tent, drowning out every other sound. But at some point, in the middle of the night, I heard something. Footsteps, not far from my tent. Slow, deliberate, moving through the mud. I stayed completely still, listening. Then silence. For what felt like an hour, I lay there, barely breathing, waiting for another sound. But nothing came. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep, but when I woke up, I felt like I hadn't rested at all. The rain wasn't letting up. My firewood was soaked. Everything smelled damp. I needed to get out of there. I packed up my things, ready to head back to my truck. Then I saw it. Another set of footprints. This time they were right outside my tent. Whoever or whatever had been out there last night had been inches from where I slept. The footprints were deep, pressed into the mud, leading away into the trees. Barefoot. Again. I didn't follow them this time. I didn't want to know. I grabbed my pack, shouldered my rifle, and started moving. The hike back felt longer than before, every step heavy with the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rain soaked through my clothes, mud clung to my boots, and every gust of wind made me whip around, expecting to see something behind me. But I never saw anyone. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back, started the engine, and didn't look back. I drove straight home. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time it rained, I felt like I was back in those woods, listening to something move outside my tent. I don't camp alone anymore, not after that week. I still don't know who or what was out there with me, but I know one thing: I wasn't alone. It had been a long time since I last camped with anyone, let alone my sir and his old retired sergeant. It wasn't something I ever planned, but when Sir asked if I was up for a trip to the woods, I didn't think much about it. He said his retired sergeant, a man named Philip, had been talking about getting out into the wilderness for a while. Said it might be his last real trip before age fully caught up with him. I didn't know Philip well. I had heard stories about him, how he was one of the toughest men Sir had worked under, a man who had seen things most people wouldn't believe. He had served his time, fought his fights, and then retired to a quiet life, but men like him didn't just sit still. When Sir told me Philip wanted one last good camping trip, I knew I couldn't turn it down. We packed light, enough food for 3 nights, rifles for hunting, knives for safety. Philip had an old tent, something he had used for decades. Sir and I had our own gear, newer, better suited for rough conditions. The plan was simple: drive out to the edge of a national forest, hike deep enough to be away from the rest of the world, set up camp, and enjoy the kind of peace that only comes from being miles away from civilization. The first day was uneventful. We hiked for hours, cutting through thick brush, moving past trees that towered over us. The deeper we got, the quieter it became. At first, that was the best part. No cars, no buzzing electronics, no distant hum of the world moving too fast. Just the sound of leaves crunching under our boots, the occasional bird overhead, and the wind pushing through the trees. But as we moved deeper, something about the silence changed. I didn't notice it right away, but there was something unnatural about it. The birds stopped singing. The wind didn't feel like it was moving as much. Even the usual rustling of small animals seemed to fade. Philip noticed it first. He was an old man, but his instincts were sharp. He kept scanning the trees, eyes narrowed. Sir picked up on it too. There were no words exchanged, but I could tell from the way they moved, slower, more cautious, that they sensed it. I started to feel it too, that heavy, almost suffocating weight that settles in your chest when you know something isn't right. We weren't alone out there. By the time we set up camp, the sun was already sinking. We had found a good clearing near a river, flat ground, plenty of space to set up our tents, and water close by. It should have been perfect. But even as we got the fire going, the air felt heavy. Not cold, just thick, like the woods were watching us. We ate in silence, listening to the crackling fire. Philip sat with his rifle on his lap, his back straight despite his age. Sir kept glancing over his shoulder every now and then, scanning the dark spaces between the trees. We turned in for the night early. The plan was to wake up before sunrise and do some hunting. But sleep didn't come easy. I lay in my tent, staring at the thin fabric walls, listening. The woods weren't as quiet as before, but the sounds were strange. Heavy footsteps, somewhere too far to pinpoint but close enough to hear. Snapping twigs, the kind that break under real weight, not just from small animals. I wasn't the only one awake. I could hear Philip shifting inside his tent, slow, controlled movements like he was reaching for his gun. Sir was still as a rock in his own tent, waiting. None of us spoke. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it. A low, dragging sound. Not footsteps, not wind, something else. Something moving through the brush with a weight that didn't feel right. Philip sat up first. I heard his rifle click. Sir followed a second later, zipping open his tent just enough to peek outside. I didn't move. I didn't want to. I just lay there, breath slow, heart pounding, listening. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The woods went silent again. Not a single leaf moved. I don't know how long we stayed like that, waiting, but eventually, the exhaustion won. I fell asleep. By sunrise, the night before felt almost like a bad dream. Almost. When I stepped outside my tent, Sir and Philip were already up, their eyes scanning the ground around our camp. Something had been there. The dirt around the campfire had been disturbed. Deep tracks, too large for a person, too heavy for an animal, sank into the soft ground. They weren't boot prints. They weren't paw prints. They were long, almost stretched, like something had been dragging itself forward. Philip crouched next to them, his jaw tight. Sir didn't say anything, but his face was set in a way that told me he was thinking hard. We should have left right then, but we didn't. We told ourselves it could have been a bear, maybe even a wounded one. We told ourselves we had weapons, we were experienced, we could handle it. So we stayed. The day passed without trouble. We hunted, we cooked, we acted like nothing was wrong. But there was something wrong. Philip, for all his years, looked more alert than ever. His eyes constantly flickered to the trees, his hands never far from his gun. Sir was the same. I felt it too, that unshakable feeling of being watched. By nightfall, the tension was thick. We took turns keeping watch. Philip volunteered first. Sir took second. I was last. By the time it was my turn, the fire had burned low. The night was dark, thicker than before. I sat there, gripping my rifle, forcing myself to stay alert. And then, just past the edge of the firelight, I saw it. A shape not fully visible, just the suggestion of something long, too thin, almost blending into the trees. It was watching. I gripped my gun tighter. Then, without a sound, it moved. Not walking, not running, just shifting, almost like a shadow stretching itself further. I blinked, and it was gone. I woke the others. Philip didn't question me. Sir didn't either. We packed up and left. It wasn't a normal hike back. We moved fast, barely speaking, constantly checking over our shoulders. The woods felt different in the daylight. The silence had weight. The air was thick. And then, just when I thought we might make it out without seeing anything else, a noise, far back, deeper in the trees. Not footsteps, not an animal, just that same dragging sound. Philip looked at Sir. Sir looked at me. We didn't stop. We didn't turn back. We just kept walking. And we didn't look behind us. Not until we were back at the truck. Only then did Philip let out a slow breath, his fingers white-knuckled around his rifle. Sir didn't say anything. Neither did I. Some things don't need to be talked about. Some things are better left in the woods. And whatever was out there, we weren't meant to see it. I've always liked being out in the wild. Started when I was young, going on weekend trips with my dad. He taught me how to set up a tent, track animals, and respect the land. Over the years, I kept up the habit, turning it into a solo thing. Being alone out there, away from all the noise, felt right. This happened a few years ago. It was late autumn, the kind of season where the days are crisp, but the nights hit hard with a deep cold that bites through layers of clothing. I had taken a week off work and drove up to a remote forest in Montana, a place I had been to once before. It was isolated, miles away from any town, and perfect for what I wanted. Some peace, some distance from everything. I packed enough food and supplies for several days, my rifle for protection, and all the gear I needed. The plan was simple. Hike deep into the forest, find a good spot near the river, and stay put for a few days. I wanted to hunt a little, fish a little, and just exist out there. The drive out was long. The farther I got, the less paved road there was, until eventually, I was on nothing but dirt and gravel. I didn't see another car for hours. By the time I reached the old trailhead, it was late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows between the trees. I parked, got my backpack on, and locked the truck. The air was cold, filled with the smell of pine and damp earth. The only sounds were my boots crunching on the ground and the occasional distant call of a bird. I hiked for several miles, following a path that wasn't really a path, just an old game trail winding through the trees. After a couple of hours, I found the spot. It was perfect, right near a small river with a clearing just big enough for my tent and fire. There were no signs of other campers, no litter, no disturbances, just untouched wilderness. I set up camp, got a fire going, and settled in for the night. I cooked some food, watched the flames dance, and listened to the river. Everything felt normal. But then, as the last bit of daylight faded, something shifted. The forest, which had been filled with distant sounds of birds and rustling leaves, went completely silent. It wasn't just quiet. It was wrong. No wind, no insects, no night sounds, just stillness. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe it was just one of those nights where everything goes still for no reason. I sat by the fire a little longer, watching the darkness settle in around me, and eventually, I crawled into my tent. At some point in the night, I woke up, not to a sound, but to the absence of one. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow against the tent fabric. Then I heard it, a single, slow footstep, not an animal, not the light, scurrying movement of a raccoon or the deliberate weight of a deer. This was a step, like a person walking barefoot on the cold earth. I stayed still, barely breathing. My rifle was within reach, but I didn't move for it yet. Then another step, closer. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it. I knew how to tell the difference between animals and people. This wasn't an animal. I reached for my rifle, slow and careful, trying not to make a sound. Then, just outside the tent, I heard breathing. Not heavy, not panting, just a slow, steady inhale and exhale, like someone standing there, just beyond the thin fabric, watching. I gripped the rifle tight, my heart pounding. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. I wanted to move, to do something, but fear kept me frozen. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited, listening, but there was nothing, just that awful, complete silence. Eventually, after what had to be at least an hour, I convinced myself that maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it had been an animal, something weird but harmless. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came, and everything felt normal again. Birds were chirping, the wind was moving through the trees. I forced myself to believe it had been nothing. I checked around my tent. No tracks, no signs that anyone had been there. I went about my day as planned. I hiked a little, fished in the river, even managed to bring down a small deer. By evening, I had almost convinced myself that I had just been paranoid. But as night fell, the feeling came back. That wrong silence, that unnatural stillness in the air. I kept my rifle close, my fire bigger than the night before. I stayed up late, staring into the trees, waiting. Then, just past midnight, I saw it. At the edge of the firelight, standing just beyond the glow, there was a figure. It was shaped like a man, tall and thin, but there was something off about it. The way it stood, the way it held itself, it wasn't right. I didn't move. I didn't blink. It stepped forward, just enough for the light to catch its face. It looked like a person, but the skin was wrong, stretched too tight, pale and dry. The eyes were too large, dark, empty. It opened its mouth slightly, and the movement was jerky, unnatural. And then, in a voice that wasn't quite right, it said my name. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen. The fire crackled, casting flickering light over its face. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep. I kept the fire burning, watching the darkness, waiting. By the next morning, I knew I had to leave. I packed up fast, not stopping to eat, barely thinking. But as I started back toward the trailhead, the woods felt different. The trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper. Every sound made me jump. Then, a few miles in, I found something that stopped me cold. My own footprints, leading back to my campsite. But I hadn't come this way before. Something had walked in my exact steps, backward, leading me in circles. I ran. I didn't stop until I saw my truck. I threw my gear in, started the engine, and tore down that dirt road without looking back. Only when I was miles away, back on paved road, did I let myself breathe. I haven't been back to that part of the woods since. I still camp, I still hunt, but not alone, never alone. Because out there in the deep, empty wild, there's something else. Something that can watch, something that can listen, and something that can walk in your footsteps. I had always liked camping alone. It gave me time to think, to clear my head from the noise of everyday life. I wasn't someone who needed much. A tent, a small fire, a good sleeping bag, and I was set. I had done it so many times that I didn't think twice about heading out on my own. I knew how to stay safe, how to keep animals away, how to read the weather. I wasn't an expert, but I was comfortable. This time, I chose a spot deeper in the woods than usual. I had taken time off work, and I wanted to be somewhere remote, away from everything. I found a location through an old hiking forum. People had talked about it years ago, saying it was a great hidden gem. No official trails led there anymore, which meant it would be quiet. Took me a few hours to hike in. The trail was overgrown, but that was part of the appeal. I had my pack, my gear, and a GPS, so I wasn't worried. By late afternoon, I found a good clearing near a small stream. The area was perfect, flat ground, plenty of firewood, and a good distance from any major paths. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and cooked a quick meal. As the sun dropped behind the trees, the air cooled. It was peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant call of an animal. I sat by the fire for a while, staring at the flames, listening to the night take over. Then, I noticed something, a sound, faint but distinct. Footsteps, not an animal, too steady, too careful. Person. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. The firelight didn't reach far, and beyond that, it was just darkness. I listened, waiting, but the sound had stopped. Maybe I imagined it. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling stayed. I wasn't alone. I was sure of it. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight. Slowly, I scanned the tree line, looking for movement. The trees stood still, unbroken. I even called out, not asking if someone was there, but more as a warning. A way to say, asterisk, I hear you. I know you're there. Asterisk, nothing. I stood there for a long time, waiting, but no one came out. No movement, no more sounds. Just silence. Eventually, I convinced myself that it had been a small animal, maybe a deer moving through the brush. I had been out here alone all day. My mind was probably just playing tricks on me. I sat back down by the fire and stayed up a little longer before heading into my tent. I slept lightly. Every small sound outside pulled me halfway back to consciousness. The wind in the trees, a branch cracking, the stream bubbling nearby. I woke up several times, checking my surroundings through the thin fabric of the tent. Each time I saw nothing. Then, sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke up to something different. A noise, not footsteps this time. Breathing, slow, steady, right outside my tent. I froze. The fire had burned low, leaving the campsite in near darkness. The only light was the dim glow of embers. I strained my ears, trying to figure out exactly where the sound was coming from. It was close, just outside. I stayed completely still. My knife was in my pack, just out of reach. My flashlight was closer, but turning it on might give away that I was awake. I listened, heart pounding. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. Silence. For a long time, I didn't move. I just lay there waiting, but nothing happened. No footsteps walking away, no rustling in the bushes. It was like whoever or whatever had been there was still standing outside, completely still. Minutes passed, then an hour. I barely breathed. Eventually, the sky started to lighten, the first hint of dawn. I forced myself to move, slowly unzipping the tent and peeking out. No one. Nothing seemed disturbed. The fire was dead, my gear untouched. The only tracks were my own, but something felt off. I packed up quickly. I wasn't sticking around to figure out what had been out there. As soon as my pack was secured, I started hiking back. I moved fast, barely stopping to catch my breath. Every so often, I stopped and listened, making sure I wasn't being followed. About an hour into the hike, I saw something. A boot print, fresh, deep in the dirt. Not mine. Someone had been out there with me, watching. I kept moving, pushing forward without stopping. When I finally reached my car, I tossed my pack inside and locked the doors. It wasn't until I was miles away that I let myself breathe again. I never went back to that spot. I never even tried to find out who else had been there. Some things I decided were better left unknown. I always liked to camp alone, not because I didn't enjoy company, but because there was something about being out in the wild, away from the noise of people, that made me feel at peace. I had been doing solo trips for years, never had a problem. I was careful, always prepared, and knew my limits. This trip was no different. At least that's what I thought. It was early fall somewhere in northern Montana. The trees were starting to turn, the air was getting crisp, and the mosquitoes were finally gone. I had picked a spot deep in the national forest, miles away from any town, just how I liked it. There was a river nearby for water, plenty of wood for a fire, and a clearing just big enough for my tent. I parked my truck a couple of miles back on an old dirt road, locked it up, and hiked in with my gear. I liked to camp where no one else did, places that weren't on the maps. I had found this spot years ago and had come back to it a few times since. There were no marked trails, no campsites, just the trees, the river, and the quiet. I spent the first day setting up camp. I built a fire pit, cleared out any rocks under my tent, and gathered enough firewood to last the night. The sun dipped below the tree line early, and by the time darkness set in, I had a solid fire going. I cooked some food, sat back, and listened to the sounds of the woods. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't really quiet at all, branches shifting, the river moving, the distant hoot of an owl. I didn't feel uneasy, not yet. That changed around midnight. I was lying in my tent, half asleep, when I heard something move outside. Not the wind, not a small animal. This was something bigger. I sat up, listening. Crunch. It was slow, deliberate, not like a deer or an elk moving through the brush. Those animals don't stop and start like that. Crunch. It was closer now, maybe 20 feet from my tent. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, but I didn't unzip the tent. Not yet. I just sat there, waiting, listening. Silence. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any sound over the crackling of my fire, which had burned down to a few glowing embers. Nothing. I waited a long time before I finally convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a raccoon, maybe a porcupine. It didn't matter. I let out a breath, lay back down, and eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and looked around. Nothing seemed off. No broken branches, no tracks that I could see. I figured I had just spooked myself. I spent most of the day fishing in the river, caught a couple of trout, cooked them over the fire. It was peaceful, just how I wanted it to be. But as the sun started to set, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was that same sensation you get when someone's watching you. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I kept looking over my shoulder, even though I knew I was alone. At least I thought I was. That night, it happened again. I was in my tent, half asleep, when the sound came back. Crunch. This time, it was closer. Crunch. I sat up fast, gripping my flashlight. My heart was hammering in my chest. I clicked the light on and pointed it at the walls of my tent, but of course, that didn't help. I needed to see outside. I unzipped the door just an inch and shined my light out. Nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. Then, just as I was about to lie back down, I heard something else. Breathing. It was slow, deep, and close, right outside my tent. I held my breath, gripping my knife now instead of the flashlight. I waited, but the breathing didn't stop. It wasn't an animal. No bear breathes like that.
No elk. No moose.
I swallowed hard, then yanked the tent door open all the way and shined my light out. Nothing, but the moment the beam hit the trees, I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the light, not moving, not saying a word, just standing there. It was tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. I didn't move. It didn't move. Then, after what felt like forever, it just stepped backward, disappearing into the trees. I sat there, frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up with my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, waiting for the sun. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed up my gear. I didn't eat, didn't drink. I just shoved everything into my pack and started hiking back to my truck. I walked fast, kept my head on a swivel. The whole time, I felt like I wasn't alone, like someone was just behind me, just out of sight. When I finally made it to my truck, I nearly collapsed with relief. I threw my gear in the back, got in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm myself down. Then, just as I was about to start the engine, I noticed something in the dirt, just outside my window. Footprints. Not boot prints. Not shoes. Bare feet. They led from the trees right up to my truck, and then right back into the woods. I didn't wait to think about it. I turned the key, threw the truck into gear, and got the hell out of there. I haven't been back since, and I never will. I've always liked camping alone, not because I don't have friends, but because there's something peaceful about being out in nature with no one else around. I never had to worry about small talk, never had to share my food, never had to listen to someone complain about mosquitoes or the cold. It was just me, my gear, and the silence of the woods. This trip wasn't supposed to be any different. I had planned it months in advance, setting aside a 3-day weekend to drive up into the Appalachian Mountains, far enough away that I wouldn't run into families or casual hikers. I wanted to be alone, completely isolated. That was the whole point. I had picked a spot deep in the national forest, miles away from the nearest town. The only way in was a winding dirt road, the kind that barely looked like a road at all. My truck handled it fine, bouncing over rocks and potholes, kicking up dust behind me. I had everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a rifle just in case. Not that I expected trouble, but out here you never know. The place I found was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by thick trees, the ground soft with pine needles. A creek ran nearby, its water clear and cold. It was late afternoon by the time I got everything set up. The air was crisp, cool enough that I knew the night would be cold. I built a fire as the sun dipped low behind the trees, eating a simple meal of beans and beef jerky. The world around me was quiet, apart from the occasional rustling in the underbrush. I was used to that: small animals, birds settling in for the night, the kind of noises that were normal out here. But then I heard something that wasn't normal. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling fire. A sound in the distance, further up the trail I had driven in on. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was footsteps. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I sat there, staring into the fire, telling myself it was just my own paranoia playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. Slow, deliberate steps on the dirt path. I turned, staring into the dark woods beyond my campsite. Nothing. No flashlight, no silhouette, no sign of anyone. I told myself it was just a deer, maybe a coyote, something harmless. But then the steps stopped. I sat there for a long time listening. The fire crackled. The wind whispered through the trees. But whoever or whatever had been walking out there wasn't moving anymore. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was nothing. I had been alone in the woods plenty of times before. Sounds carry weird out here. It was probably an animal that had frozen when it heard my fire, watching me from the shadows. I finished eating, put out the fire, and crawled into my tent. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound outside made me tense up, listening. But after a while, exhaustion won out. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. Something was moving outside my tent. Not an animal. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Right outside the thin fabric wall that separated me from whatever was out there. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My rifle was within arm's reach, but I didn't want to make a sound. The steps circled the tent. Whoever it was didn't have a flashlight. No light, no voice, no indication of who they were. Just the sound of boots in the dirt. Then they stopped, right at the front of my tent. I gripped my rifle, heart pounding so hard I was afraid they would hear it. I waited. Minutes passed. Then the steps started again, moving away. Slow, steady, fading into the darkness. I lay there for what felt like hours, rifle in my hands, listening. Nothing. Eventually, the exhaustion caught up with me again, and I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, sunlight was filtering through the trees. I sat up slowly, every muscle in my body tense. My tent flap was still zipped. My gear was untouched. But outside, just a few feet from where I had been sleeping, I saw them.
Hoofprints.
Clear, deep impressions in the dirt, circling my tent. Someone had been there. I packed up fast. My trip was supposed to be 3 days, but I wasn't about to stick around for another night. As I loaded my gear into the truck, I felt eyes on me. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing, just the wind through the leaves. I climbed into the truck, started the engine, and turned around on the narrow dirt path. As I drove away, I checked my mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave. There was nothing, but I never went camping alone again, and I never will. I had been in law enforcement long enough to know that bad men could be found anywhere. It didn't matter how deep into the woods you went, how far off the road you thought you were, or how alone you convinced yourself you had become. Bad men always found a way. The operation had been planned for weeks. Our target was a man named Walter Pike. Pike was a ghost of sorts, a shadow that moved just outside the edges of society. He had a long list of crimes to his name, the worst of them involving murder. Not random, not reckless, but precise and deliberate. The kind of killing that took planning, patience, and a mind twisted in a way I could never understand. The last known location had put him somewhere in the mountain forests of Montana, deep in the backcountry where only seasoned outdoorsmen and men with nothing to lose dared to tread. The place was wild, untouched. Thick pines stretched for miles, their towering bodies choking out the sky, casting everything below in a permanent shade. The terrain was unforgiving, jagged cliffs, hidden drop-offs, and dense underbrush that could swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful. We had tracked Pike for months, but he was always ahead of us. Every safe house we raided, every contact we pressed for information, led us only to places he had already left behind. It wasn't until a hiker stumbled upon an old campsite deep in the woods, complete with spent shell casings and blood-stained earth, that we got our first real lead. The team was small, just 4 of us. A larger force would have drawn attention. Pike had eyes everywhere. He was a former soldier, someone who knew how to move unseen, someone who understood patience. If he knew we were coming, he would disappear again. We couldn't afford that. We hiked in, carrying only what we needed: weapons, supplies, and enough food to last us a week. The plan was simple: set up camp near the last known location, monitor for movement, and wait. We knew he would return eventually. People like him always did. The forest wasn't just a hiding place for him. It was home. By the 3rd day, the quiet started to feel unnatural. It wasn't the usual silence of the woods, the kind that came with the absence of human noise. It was deeper than that. The birds had stopped singing. The wind had died down. Even the rustling of small animals in the brush seemed to vanish. It was as if the forest itself had gone still, holding its breath. The first sign of trouble came that night. We had set up a perimeter around the camp, tripwires strung between trees, small warning devices meant to alert us to any movement. Around midnight, one of them went off, a sharp, metallic snap that echoed through the stillness. We moved fast, spreading out, weapons drawn. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, landing on the disturbed tripwire. The line had been cut, not broken. Clean slice, deliberate. Whoever had done it knew what they were doing. They hadn't tripped it by accident. They had disabled it on purpose. We spent the next few hours watching, waiting. Nothing came. No sounds, no movement. But we knew better than to think it had been a false alarm. We were being watched. Someone was out there, just beyond the reach of our lights, just beyond the edges of our senses. The next morning, we found tracks, footprints, partially hidden among the fallen leaves and pine needles. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. They led deeper into the woods, towards an area none of us had scouted yet. We followed them. The deeper we went, the worse it got. The air felt heavier, the trees closer. The forest seemed to close in around us, suffocating in a way I had never experienced before. And then we found the first body. It wasn't one of ours. It was a hunter, or what was left of him. The man had been dead for days, maybe weeks. His body was torn apart, not by an animal, but by something far worse. His throat had been slit, his torso opened up. A message had been carved into his chest. One word: leave. We didn't. By nightfall, we were back at camp, but none of us could sleep. We took turns keeping watch, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt it. The presence. The weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. Pike was here. He had always been here, and now he was playing with us. The next day, one of our guys disappeared. Sanchez. He had gone to relieve himself just 50 feet from camp. We heard nothing.
No struggle, no scream.
Just gone. His rifle was still leaning against the tree where he had set it down. His footprints led away from camp, but there was no sign of him. We searched for hours, calling his name, listening for anything. The woods swallowed our voices, giving nothing back. That night, I found something just outside the perimeter. A small object, half buried in the dirt. It was Sanchez's badge. It had been placed there deliberately. A warning, a trophy. We needed to get out. We should have left the moment we found that first body. But pride, duty, whatever it was, kept us there. We thought we could win. We thought we could hunt him. We were wrong. The attack came just before dawn. Silent, precise. The first shot took out Daniels, a single bullet through the skull. The second hit Miller, taking him in the leg. He screamed, and that was all it took. Panic set in, the forest exploding with gunfire. Shadows moved between the trees, fast, too fast. We fired at nothing, at ghosts in the darkness. And then it was just me. I ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life. The forest blurred around me, the air thick and wet in my lungs. I didn't stop. Not when my legs burned, not when my chest ached. I kept moving until the gunfire faded, until the only sound left was the pounding of my own heart. By the time I reached the road, the sky was turning gray. The world outside the forest felt different, unreal. I collapsed onto the asphalt, my breath coming in ragged gasps. They never found the others. Their bodies were never recovered. The case was closed, marked as an unsolved incident. Officially, Walter Pike was still out there, still hiding, still waiting. I knew the truth. He wasn't hiding. He was hunting. The rain started in the late afternoon, just a light drizzle at first, barely noticeable beneath the thick Amazon canopy. I had been hiking all day, my boots sinking into the damp earth, sweat clinging to my back despite the cooling mist. The plan was simple: set up camp before nightfall, stay the night, and move on in the morning. But plans don't always work out the way you expect. By the time I found a decent spot, the rain had become heavier, drumming against the leaves above me. I was deep in the rainforest, miles from any road or village. The only sounds were the steady patter of raindrops, the occasional call of distant birds, and the rustling of unseen creatures moving through the undergrowth. I found a small clearing, just large enough for my tent, and worked quickly to set up. The ground was already soft and muddy, making it difficult to drive my stakes in properly. The rain had turned the soil to sludge, and every step I took made a sickening squelch. But I managed. I got the tent up, spread my gear inside, and climbed in just as the downpour became a full-on deluge. Inside, it was cramped but dry. I unzipped my pack, pulled out a small gas stove, and lit it carefully. The blue flame flickered, casting strange shadows against the thin fabric of my tent. I warmed up a meal from a vacuum-sealed pouch, the the smell of food filling the small space. I was exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come easy. The jungle doesn't sleep. Even through the rain, I could hear the sounds of the rainforest all around me. Chirps, croaks, distant howls. The Amazon is full of life, most of it hidden just beyond sight. The occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a branch made my pulse jump, but I told myself it was nothing. Probably just a monkey or some nocturnal animal moving through the trees. But then I heard something that made my skin prickle. A low, deliberate crunch. Not the sound of a small animal. Not the random fall of a branch. This was something heavier, something moving with purpose. I held my breath, listening. The sound came again. Closer this time. A slow, careful footstep in the wet foliage. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming the beam toward the entrance of my tent. The rain distorted the sounds, but I could still hear the movement. I wasn't alone. The rational part of my brain told me it was an animal, maybe a tapir, maybe a jaguar, maybe something harmless. But another part of me, the part that had spent too many nights alone in the wild, told me something wasn't right. I stayed completely still, listening. Then silence. No birds, no insects, nothing. The rainforest had gone completely still, except for the sound of the rain. I've spent enough time in the wild to know that when the jungle goes silent, it usually means a predator is near. I tightened my grip on my flashlight, my heart pounding against my ribs. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. I knew I had to check. If I stayed inside my tent and something was out there, I'd be trapped. I reached for the zipper, pulling it down just enough to peek out. The darkness outside was almost complete. My flashlight beam cut through the rain, illuminating the wet leaves and the trunks of towering trees. Nothing moved. I listened again. Nothing. I started to feel foolish. Maybe it had just been my imagination. The jungle is full of strange sounds, and paranoia can make you hear things that aren't there. I zipped the tent closed and lay back down, forcing myself to breathe slowly. And then a soft rustling, right outside my tent. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my machete, held the flashlight in my other hand, and threw open the tent flap. The beam of light cut through the rain and landed on something. A shape, low to the ground, unmoving. For a second, I thought it was an animal, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw it wasn't. It was something covered in leaves and mud, lying perfectly still. My stomach twisted. It was a person, or at least it had been. The body was face down, half submerged in the mud, motionless. The rain had washed away most of the blood, but I could still see deep gashes along the arms and back. Whoever this had been, they had died violently. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. I wasn't alone out here. Someone had done this. The jungle was silent again, except for the hammering rain. Then I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, close. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but I saw nothing, just darkness, shifting shadows, and endless trees. Panic clawed at my throat. I had to get out of here. I grabbed my pack, my hands shaking, stuffing whatever I could into it. I didn't care about the tent. I didn't care about anything except getting away. I moved fast, pushing through the wet undergrowth, slipping in the mud. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I ran, but I didn't dare turn it off. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. The footsteps followed, not running, just walking, slow, steady, unhurried. Whoever it was, they weren't in a rush. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the branches that whipped against my face, the thick roots that tried to trip me. My lungs burned, my muscles ached, but I kept going. Then up ahead I saw it, a light, flickering, distant. I ran toward it, my last bit of strength carrying me forward. The light was coming from a small wooden structure, half hidden by the trees. A cabin. I reached the door and pounded on it. No answer. I didn't care. I shoved it open and stumbled inside, slamming it behind me. The room was empty, dusty, old, abandoned, but there was a fire still smoldering in the fireplace. Someone had been here recently. I turned off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, breathing hard. Outside, in the rain, I heard the footsteps stop, just beyond the trees. They had followed me. I waited. Minutes passed. The rain kept falling. Then nothing.
No footsteps.
No movement. Just the jungle. I stayed in that cabin until morning, barely sleeping, my machete in my lap. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside, my heart pounding. The body was gone. No sign of it.
No footprints.
No sign that anyone had ever been there. But I knew what I had seen. And I knew, without a doubt, that I had not been alone. I didn't like being in the house much after she passed. Everything in it reminded me of her. The smell of her shampoo still lingering on the pillows, her favorite coffee mug still sitting in the cupboard, the way the light came through the window in the mornings, casting that soft glow over the spot on the couch where she used to sit. It all made it harder to breathe, harder to exist. So, I packed up my things and left. Camping had always been something we did together. Every summer, every long weekend, every time life started feeling too loud, we'd load up the truck and disappear into the woods. It was our thing. But now it was just me. I didn't pick a familiar place this time. I didn't want the weight of memories sitting on my shoulders while I tried to get through the night. I wanted somewhere new, somewhere quiet, somewhere where I could just be alone, away from the world, away from the people who looked at me with that pity in their eyes. I drove out past the last town, past the gas stations and the old diners, past the places where people still existed. I didn't stop until the roads turned to dirt and the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the tires crunching over gravel. I found a spot near a lake, deep enough in the woods that I hadn't seen another car in miles. It was perfect. The air was crisp when I stepped out of the truck, colder than I expected. The kind of cold that sunk into your bones, that made you think about how alone you really were out there. The sun was starting to set by the time I got the tent up and the fire going. The sky had that deep orange hue, fading into purple, the kind of sky that always made her stop and stare, always made her tell me how much she loved this, being out here away from it all. I tried not to think about it. I ate in silence, listening to the fire crackle, the distant sound of water lapping against the shore. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, no sounds of animals in the brush, just silence. The kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of every breath, every shift in the air, every single thing that didn't belong. I didn't realize how tired I was until I lay down in the tent. The exhaustion wasn't just in my body, it was in my bones, in my chest, in the space where she used to be. I must have fallen asleep fast because the next thing I knew, I was awake again. But something felt off. It wasn't a noise that woke me. It was the absence of it. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow through the thin fabric of the tent. I listened, trying to figure out what had changed. There was nothing. No wind.
No crickets.
No water lapping at the shore. Just dead, empty silence. Then I heard it. A crunch. Soft, slow, deliberate. Not an animal. Not the random shifting of the trees. Something else. Something walking. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening. Came again. Another step. Closer this time. The tent fabric didn't give me much to see. Just shadows. Just vague movements beyond the dim glow of the fire. I reached slowly for my knife, the one I always kept next to me when I camped. My fingers wrapped around the handle, grip tightening. Another step. Then nothing. Minutes passed. Maybe longer. I didn't move. didn't breathe. Then, just when I thought maybe it had been my imagination, another step. Right outside the tent. Close enough that if I reached out, I could touch whatever was standing there. I stayed frozen, heart pounding in my ears. Then slowly I saw the shadow shift. Not away, down, like someone crouching, watching. I gripped the knife tighter, trying to keep my breathing steady. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to move, to do something, but I didn't. I just waited. The shadow didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as slowly as it had come, it disappeared. The steps moved away, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake, listening, waiting, every muscle tense, every nerve on edge. The silence stretched on, the only sound my own breathing. But nothing else happened. By the time the sun started creeping over the treetops, I was already packing up. I didn't waste time. I didn't stop to eat. I just packed and left, not bothering to look back. I told myself it was just an animal, just my own paranoia playing tricks on me. But when I got back to my truck, when I went to unlock the door, my stomach dropped. There, in the thin layer of dirt on the window, was a handprint. Not mine, and too big to be hers. Just one, pressed against the glass, like someone had been watching me, waiting. I never went back to that place again. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself, or maybe I just didn't think it through. Either way, I found myself driving down an empty stretch of road, miles away from the nearest town. With my gear in the back and the plan already set in my head, I was going to spend the night camping in a graveyard. It wasn't a dare, and it wasn't something I planned with friends. It was just an idea that came to me after reading about old, abandoned burial grounds that had been left to the elements. There was one about 30 miles from where I lived, a place that had been around since the 1800s but was now forgotten, overgrown, and falling apart. People barely talked about it anymore, and when they did, it was only to say how hard it was to find. The land had been sold off over the years, and the roads leading there had faded into nothing but dirt trails and thick woods. It was the kind of place that didn't exist on maps anymore, just a memory buried under layers of time. I had found it after hours of searching online, buried deep in old records and forgotten history forums. The last mention of it was from over 20 years ago, a passing comment from a hiker who said they stumbled upon it by accident. I knew it was risky. If I got lost or stuck, no one would know where I was. But something about it made me want to see it for myself, to step into a place that had been left untouched for so long. The drive was quiet, the road stretching ahead of me in the fading light. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of life I saw. Houses became scarce, the occasional mailbox standing like a forgotten marker of what used to be. By the time I turned onto the dirt path that led toward the graveyard, the sun was already dipping below the trees. The road was rough, barely more than 2 tire tracks cutting through the woods. Branches scraped against the sides of my truck as I moved forward, the tires kicking up dust. I finally reached a small clearing where I could park. I turned off the engine, and for a moment, everything was silent. No wind, no birds, just stillness. I grabbed my bag and my tent, locked the truck, and started walking. The graveyard was still a few hundred yards ahead, hidden in the thick woods. The path wasn't much of a path anymore. Nature had reclaimed most of it, leaving only faint signs that anyone had ever walked here. The deeper I went, the more it felt like stepping back in time. Trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches reaching across the trail. The air smelled damp, like old leaves and soil. After what felt like an hour, I finally saw it, the graveyard. It wasn't much, just a small clearing with crumbling headstones scattered around. Some were leaning, others half buried under the earth. The names were worn away, the years barely visible. I counted maybe 20 or 30 graves, all spread out in no particular order. A rusted iron fence ran along one side, half of it collapsed, the rest covered in vines. I took my time walking through, reading the names that I could still make out. Most of them were from the late 1800s, a few from the early 1900s. There were no fresh graves, no signs that anyone had been here in years. It was just a forgotten place, left to rot. I picked a spot near the center to set up my tent. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks making it hard to find a flat surface. But eventually, I got everything set up, tent secured, sleeping bag rolled out. I built a small fire with the wood I had brought, the light flickering against the trees. As the night settled in, the temperature dropped. The air felt heavier, the silence more noticeable. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. It should have been peaceful, but it wasn't. Something about the place felt wrong. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but a sense that I didn't belong here. Hours passed, and I finally crawled into my tent, zipping it up behind me. I lay there listening. No animals, no insects, just silence. I told myself it was fine. The woods had their own rhythm, their own way of being. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to a sound outside. It was faint, almost like a footstep. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer passing through. But then I heard it again, closer. A single step, then another. The sound was slow, deliberate. I held my breath, straining to hear. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving only a faint glow. I reached for my flashlight, flicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of my tent. The sound stopped. I waited, my heart pounding. Nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the wind picking up slightly, rustling the leaves outside. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my spine. I lay back down, forcing myself to relax. Minutes passed, then crunch. A sound closer this time, just outside my tent. I sat up, gripping the flashlight. My breath was shallow, my hands tense. Then something brushed against the fabric of the tent. A slow, dragging motion. Not an animal, not the wind. Someone was outside. Couldn't move, frozen in place. My mind raced. Who else would be out here? This place was abandoned, forgotten. No roads, no trails, nothing to bring anyone this way. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. The silence stretched on. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed. Nothing. I slowly reached for the zipper, hesitating before pulling it down an inch, just enough to peek outside. My flashlight beam swept across the clearing. The graves, the trees, the old rusted fence. Nothing. I exhaled, my breath shaky. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on me. I pulled the zipper back up and forced myself to lie down. Took a long time to fall asleep, but eventually I did. When I woke up, it was still dark. I didn't know what time it was, but something felt wrong. Then I saw it. The entrance to my tent was open. The zipper was undone halfway down. I sat up so fast my head spun. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it outside, my pulse hammering. The clearing was empty. My fire was completely dead, just cold ashes now. I checked my bag. Nothing was missing. No signs that anyone had touched it. But the tent, someone had opened it while I was sleeping. That was enough for me. I packed up in record time, stuffing everything into my bag without bothering to organize it. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. As I stepped out of the tent, I scanned the area again. Still nothing. Just the graves, silent and undisturbed. The woods stretched into darkness beyond the clearing. I started back toward my truck, moving as fast as I could without breaking into a run. The path was harder to follow in the dark, every twisted branch and uneven step making me feel like I was being watched. Took longer to get back than I remembered. Every sound made my skin crawl, every shadow stretched too long. When I finally saw my truck, I nearly ran to it. I threw my bag in the back, got in, and locked the doors. My hands fumbled with the keys before I finally got the engine started. The headlights cut through the darkness, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement near the edge of the trees. I didn't wait to find out. I threw the truck into reverse, backed out, and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on real roads, back in places with streetlights and houses and people. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I just knew I was never going back. Whoever had been out there that night, they had been watching me. They had been close enough to touch my tent, to open it while I slept. And I never even heard them leave. I had been planning this camping trip for months. Work had been suffocating, and I needed a break, just a few days away from everything. I wasn't new to camping. I had done it plenty of times before, and I liked going alone. There was something peaceful about being in nature without distractions. No phones, no emails, no noise. Just the sound of the wind in the trees, the occasional rustle of wildlife, and the distant trickle of a stream somewhere nearby. I chose a spot deep in a forested region of southern France, not far from a small village. It wasn't a popular site, and that's exactly why I picked it. I wanted solitude. I parked my car at the end of a dirt road, loaded my backpack with supplies, and started hiking into the woods. The first few hours were nothing but calm. The forest was dense, but the trail was manageable. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the ground in shifting patterns of light and shadow. I followed the path deeper, the sound of my boots crunching over fallen leaves the only thing breaking the silence. I found a clearing near a small stream and set up camp. The spot was perfect, far enough from any roads or trails that I wouldn't run into other hikers, but not so isolated that I couldn't find my way back. I pitched my tent, set up a small fire, and spent the afternoon relaxing. As the sun dipped lower, the forest changed. The warm golden hues of daylight faded into the cool grays and blues of dusk. The air became crisper, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. I had built a fire to keep warm, but as darkness crept in, an unease settled over me. I had camped alone before, but something about this place felt different. I chalked it up to my own mind playing tricks on me. Being alone in the woods can do that. Every little sound seems amplified. The snap of a twig, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves. It was all normal. But then, I noticed something strange. At the edge of the firelight, just beyond where the trees swallowed the night, I saw movement. A shadow. It wasn't an animal. It was too still, too human-shaped. My breath caught in my throat as I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out what I was seeing. A woman. She was standing just at the edge of the trees, half hidden by the darkness. I could barely make out her face, but her posture was unnatural, rigid, unmoving. She was staring at me. I felt my skin crawl. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe she was another camper, lost or looking for help. But something about the way she just stood there, silent and motionless, didn't feel right. I forced myself to look away, pretending I hadn't noticed her. If she needed help, she would say something. But she didn't. Minutes passed. The fire crackled, filling the silence. I glanced back. She was still there. Something told me not to acknowledge her, not to call out, not to move. I stayed still, my body tense, my mind racing. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes on the fire as if I hadn't seen her. My heart pounded as I made my way to my tent, unzipping it as quietly as I could. I crawled inside and zipped it shut, barely daring to breathe. The fire outside flickered, casting shifting shadows against the thin fabric of my tent. I listened, straining to hear any movement. Footsteps, a voice, anything. Nothing. Minutes passed, then an hour. Slowly, my breathing steadied. Maybe she had left. Maybe I had imagined her standing there. Or maybe she had just been another camper. Someone who didn't realize how creepy they looked standing in the dark. I convinced myself of that. Eventually, exhaustion won. I lay down, trying to push the unease from my mind. Then I heard it. A sound outside. Soft, deliberate, breathing, right next to my tent. My entire body went rigid. I could feel my own heartbeat, loud and fast. The breathing was slow, steady, too close, right outside. I stayed as still as possible, barely daring to breathe myself. Then, the worst part, something pressed against the fabric of my tent. A hand, palm, sliding slowly down. My stomach twisted. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the hand pulled away. The breathing stopped. Silence. I stayed awake for hours, listening. Nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I must have drifted off. I woke up at first light. The fire had burned down to embers. The forest was silent. I unzipped the tent slowly, my heart hammering. I stepped out. The clearing looked the same. The trees, the stream, everything in place. But then I saw them. Footprints, bare feet, circling my tent. I packed up immediately. I didn't even eat breakfast. I threw everything into my backpack, my hands shaking. I started hiking back the way I had come, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The entire way back, I felt watched. When I finally reached my car, I tossed my gear inside and locked the doors before even starting the engine. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel. I drove nonstop until I reached the nearest town. I checked into a small motel, locked the door behind me, and sat on the bed, my mind racing. Who was she? What did she want? I'll never know. I never went camping alone again. I don't camp anymore. I used to love it. Getting away from everything, no phone, no noise, no people. Just the wind through the trees, the smell of pine and damp earth, the quiet crackle of a fire. That's all I ever wanted. But I don't camp anymore. It was late October, years back. I had a couple of days off and decided to go solo camping deep in the mountains of northern Arizona. I won't say exactly where. I don't want anyone going there. The place was remote, a good 20-mile drive down a dirt road from the last paved stretch, then another few miles on foot. That's how I liked it. No campsites, no trails, just the forest and me. The first day was uneventful. I set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by thick pines, a little way off from a shallow creek. The place felt perfect. I collected firewood, cooked some simple meals, and just enjoyed being out there. The only sounds were the wind pushing through the trees and the occasional rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. Normal wood stuff. That night, I had a fire going and was just sitting back, staring into the flames. It had gotten cold quickly after the sun went down, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. But I had my layers, my sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, and I wasn't worried. Then I heard it, something moving in the trees. Not just the little scurrying of a squirrel or the quiet steps of a deer. This was different, heavy, deliberate, not crashing through the brush but moving with purpose, just far enough out that I couldn't see anything. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a bear, maybe an elk, but I'd been in the woods enough to know how those animals sounded. This was different, I kept the fire going a little longer than usual, listening. Whatever it was, it didn't come closer. Eventually, I convinced myself I was overthinking it, doused the fire, and crawled into my tent. Sleep didn't come easy. I woke up a few times to the sound of something shifting outside, but I didn't go out to check. I didn't want to know. The next morning, I found footprints near my campsite. Not human, not quite animal. The front part looked like a hoof, but the back had long, twisted impressions like something had toes that dragged in the dirt. I tried to convince myself it was just a weird elk track, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I should have left then, but I didn't. That afternoon, I hiked a few miles out, following the creek, just to get a sense of the area. I didn't see another soul. Not a hunter, not a hiker. No one. When I got back to my campsite, something was wrong. I always set my gear up the same way. Tent flap facing east, fire pit just a few steps in front, my food hanging from a high tree branch. But something was off. My tent looked shifted. Not a lot, but just enough that I knew it wasn't where I left it. The firewood I'd stacked was scattered. My food bag was untouched, but the rope looked looser, like someone had tried to get to it and stopped. I checked for tracks, but didn't see anything obvious. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe I had been careless when setting up. But I knew that wasn't true. That night, I kept the fire burning bright. The woods were too silent. No insects, no night birds, nothing. The only sound was the occasional rustling in the distance. I didn't eat. I just sat there, staring into the dark. Around midnight, I smelled it. Rot, like something had died and had been left to fester in the sun for days. But it came on fast, like a wave rolling through the trees, thick and suffocating. My eyes watered, and my stomach twisted. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. That's when I saw it. A figure, tall, too tall, standing just at the edge of the firelight. At first, I thought it was a man, but the proportions were wrong. The legs were too long, the arms hanging low, the neck craned at an unnatural angle. The worst part, the face. It looked almost human, but the skin was stretched, pulled tight like a mask. The eyes were too deep, like holes cut into rotten flesh. I didn't move, couldn't. It didn't move either, just stood there watching. I don't know how long I sat there, gripping my knife, trying to control my breathing. My fire was burning low, and I knew I had to do something. Slowly, I reached for the extra logs beside me, never taking my eyes off the thing. I tossed one into the flames, and the fire jumped, casting more light. It was gone, just like that. I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going until the first light of dawn. As soon as the sun was up, I packed my gear. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The walk back felt longer. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind made my heart hammer. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that thing again. But I didn't. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear in and started the engine, not even bothering to check my map. I just wanted to be gone. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Something was standing at the tree-line, watching. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I never went back, and I never will.